Today we're going to talk about authorship. Just before we start, let me just introduce myself very quickly. I'm the Executive Director of the Center of Genomics and Policy. It's a research center affiliated with the Faculty of Medicine here at McGill, and most of what we do is look at ethical and legal issues pertaining to human genomics, but also other health-related matters. And authorship fits into the larger research integrity field. And this is something that when we look at ethical issues in research is one of the things that will come up. Authorship is mainly related to the outcome of research, but still nonetheless is a very pertinent topic to discuss, explore, investigate, especially when we are, at the student level, the investigator level, even for the public. So maybe to help us orient the discussion today, and since we're a small group, maybe you can tell me a little bit, very quickly, where you're coming from in terms of your interest in this topic, whether or not you're a student, and what interests you more. Sure, that's very interesting. So, everybody's coming at it from a different angle. Obviously, today's presentation is not going to be an exhaustive, look at all these things. What I really want to do is talk to you about the general principles, give you a few examples, and we're going to make it as dynamic as possible, because I'm probably going to ask you more questions than you're going to ask me. But it's going to be very important because most of the times, issues that have to do with ethics and research tend to be things that we instinctively think about. Like, well, I'm not really sure this is actually correct. There's something here that seems weird. And then there is an underpinning of it. And we're going to try to look through the general principles on where that would actually fit. And when we talk about authorship as well, we talk about a lot of sweat and a lot of work. And people also deserve to be well attributed to the work that they've done. And there are various points where it's a little, what you said, gray areas that we have. We can have, a relationship between a student and their supervisor. There can be a relationship between a member of a research project and other team members as well. And there also could be situations where the nature itself of the project is so vast that there are some difficulties in terms of understanding who will be properly attributed, who would need to be acknowledged. Think about, large biobanks. Okay, so you have those very big projects, large biobanks that collect data and samples from participants. You have a number of different people working on them. And you're going to have a number of different people accessing those data and samples to further their own research and publish. So how do they acknowledge the biobank? How do they acknowledge the biobankers? These are examples where, we are still debating and looking into the best approaches. I'm going to just very quickly reiterate some of the points that were raised. When we look at research integrity, there are principles, there are values, but the whole idea of looking at research integrity cannot be just from a sanction perspective. We can't really look at it just simply, well, okay, you've done that, then this is the sanction that we're going to give you. Sanction is a result of, malpractice, but at the same time, we are obliged to promote and to prevent this from happening. And the goal of today's presentation is to really look into those, as we said, points that need to be raised for us to be able to ask the right questions. And as you've seen, remember this, when we talk about authorship, the main point is going to come back at all times as to how to manage expectations. It's all about managing expectations. Okay? So, research integrity, researchers will strive to follow the best research practices honestly, accountably, openly, and fairly in the search for and in the dissemination of knowledge. In addition, researchers shall follow the requirements of applicable institutional policies and professional or disciplinary standards, and shall comply with applicable laws and regulations. Now, that's a lot of stuff. Let's try to break it down, okay? Now, let's just take an example that's outside of, let's say, academia. You're waking up in the morning, first thing you look at? News. Okay? Now, what makes you look at one particular newspaper rather than the other? Other than the fact it's a language that you're more comfortable with. But what else?
Credibility.
Credibility. Okay? And how does credibility come? Is it because someone said that this is a really good journal, or is it because you've personally, looked at others and you decided that's the one where I felt was very credible? Is it something, do you hear from people, or by proper experience, or both?
You look at something based on people's recommendations, and then you decide for your own whether
it's by reputation,
yeah.
but also through your
yeah.
practice. Now, why is credibility important for news?
Because you want to know about the right information. You want to make sure that whatever you're reading is true and it's honest.
Okay, and this is a tough question, but can anything be really that true and honest, or are we looking for objectivity? What are we looking for exactly?
Objectivity, yeah.
Okay, because at the end of the day, what you're interested in is being able to have the proper information to make you decide how you're going to see something.
Right.
But that's not always the case. There's a lot of situations where, when you read it, it kind of goes into a certain angle. You can see it by the way it's written, and so on. And we talk about biases as well. When we talk about news, and we talk about the fact that news need to be credible, there is a reason for that. Not just because we're very smart people and we really want to know the truth or know where to get the right information. There's a reason why we expect news to be actually accurate and fact-checked. Why do you think that's the case?
It affects the opinion of the public.
Yes.
Does it have an influence on how people think about things, so they can sort of direct people into a certain direction?
Exactly. So if you say something in the news that in a very hot, tense area of the world, one group committed a big crime against another group, and it actually isn't true, but you said that, you should expect that there will be ramifications for this happening. And if we build on that, and we talk about, other type of news, it could be medical news, where the first thing we look at in the news is saying, we've associated a certain drug with a certain disease, or a certain vaccine with a certain disease. And that information, you can imagine, because it is in, lay news or in the news out to the public, you can imagine or expect that people will react and act upon that information. They're going to decide to, okay, well, you know what, we're not going to buy this drug anymore. And you know what, we're not going to be taking that vaccine or that vaccine, and so on and so forth. Now, the important thing is, again, going back to the accuracy of the matter. And while in news it could have small to very big ramifications, you can say the same thing about research. And you can say the same thing about scientific research. Because when you are doing research, say here in Canada, most of the times the money that is going to be used to fund you comes from public sources. And if you look at all the criteria for the proper adjudication of your funding or your application, you want to see a benefit for society in some way or another. If you're working in engineering, we're going to have to see that. If you're working for social sciences, we're going to need to see this. And if you're working in health research, we're going to have to see it. It needs to be tangible. We can see what the outcome would be and how beneficial it will be for the public. Now, when it comes to research integrity, the idea is to be able to allow you to perform all of your research from beginning to end, keeping in mind those main practices: honesty, accountability, openness, and fairness. And the reason why is because we want to ensure, as much as possible, that any information that is then made public, first of all, you're going to have to think about your research community. Because, you know, the idea of publishing is not just simply to have your name there. That's one of the things that we obviously want. We want to be authors. We want to have, you know, you click on PubMed and you put your last name and you're happy to see a number of different entries. Or you look at ResearchGate and there's a score, right? And you go to Google Scholar, it tells you how many people cited your work. It's fabulous. It's great. But at the same time, you're not putting that information out there just for that. You're putting it as well to make a contribution. And people are going to be basing their work, or at least building their work, thanks to some of the things that you've done and contributed. That's how we progress. If what you submit is on shaky grounds, then anything that's going to build up from that is going to be also shaky. So it has the same ramification. And don't think that it's going to just be small ramifications. It could be huge ramifications. If the information that is put out to the public is wrong or falsified or misattributed, well, it's going to create an issue of trust, problem of trust. If science has an emotion, it will be trust. That's the only way it could be sustained, right? So when we talk about honesty, you know, there are various examples we can give for that. And obviously, you know, they're very straightforward. You know, when you were citing someone, make sure that you cite, you know, really and show the reference. Accountability is an element that we sometimes forget about, but it's extremely important. When you have your name somewhere, you're accountable for the information that you put there. And you have to be able to show, you know, and say and defend it. Openness, fairness, these are all elements that will help sustain the research projects as we move forward. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about authorship. The idea of having institutional policies is quite important, because we can start by laws and regulations. Okay? There might be laws in certain countries about copyright and sometimes about authorship and the regulations as well, but these generally tend to be quite broad in nature. Some of them are specific, but mainly have a broad implementation. And then you have professional standards. Okay? Sometimes some of the information that are given are too technical, or at least not actionable enough, that some professional bodies decide, okay, well, you know, we're going to take those very general elements and create something out of this. Give a little bit more specific guidance to our community, to our own profession. And that has happened over the years. And then you have institutional policies, because you're either studying at McGill, or whether you're studying or teaching or faculty member in any university or in any institution, there tends to be code of conduct, there tends to be research integrity offices, ombudsmen, and so on and so forth. And these individuals and bodies are there to help not only the individuals, but also adjudicate on these matters as well. This is something also that you've seen maybe from the research integrity presentation, and these were, you know, research integrity policy breaches. And many of them have to do with publication, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, redundant publications, invalid authorship, inadequate acknowledgement, mismanagement of conflict of interest. Okay? These are elements and matters that would be considered as potential breaches of these principles that we talked about openness, fairness, about honesty, transparency. Let's talk about authorship now. Okay. This is a lovely cartoon that we tend to pass around and show to students and show to other colleagues, where you have an author list, and you have the first author who's a senior grad student on the project who made the figures. The second author is a grad student in the lab that has nothing to do with the project, right? But was included because he or she hung around the group meetings, and it's usually for the food. Then you have the third author who's a first-year student who actually did the experiment, right? Performed the analysis and wrote the whole paper. But thinks being third author is actually fair, right? Because first year student, junior student, they think, oh, that's great, I'm actually an author. And then you have the middle authors who, these are names that nobody actually reads, and they're reserved for undergrads and technical staff. And then you have the second to last author who's an ambitious assistant professor or postdoc who instigated the paper. And the last author is the head honcho, right? Hasn't even read the paper, but hey, he got the funding, and his famous name will get the paper accepted. Okay? Obviously this is cartooning, but it's actually sometimes what happens in reality, unfortunately. Okay? And we're going to use this today to talk about all the different issues that are pertinent. Now, just from looking at this, what is your impression? What's your first impression by looking at that? Obviously, other than it's funny.
Sad but true.
Sad but true. Okay. And let's go deeper a little bit into that comment. Okay. What are the issues that you see?
Well, if the third author, which is the first year student who actually did the experiments and wrote the paper, he should be the first author, is to give credit where credit is due.
Mm-hmm. Are you not worried that if we do that, maybe the paper is not going to be actually accepted?
Why not? Because
isn't it supposed to be peer reviewed?
Yeah, it's supposed to be peer reviewed.
Yeah.
And it's a question of putting the first author, which is the senior grad student, but he didn't make any contribution. If he was there, if that senior grad student was there to direct the project, or was in on the meetings, yeah, but he shouldn't be the first author because he didn't do the majority of the experiments or write the paper.
But he's a senior grad student.
Doesn't matter.
Seniority over the first year student.
Seniority shouldn't be a focus for authorship. It's about who, it's what I believe, it's about who contributed most to the paper. I think the point of contention comes in when the third author did most of the experiments but didn't write the paper.
Yes.
And the first author wrote the paper. That's where, I've seen cases where the first and second author in the publication, they say that first and second author contributed equally to the publication. I think that's where such a scenario would come into place. But in this specific example, I think it's really unfair to the student who actually did most of the work.
I like that word, unfair. So there's an issue of fairness, right? Now, obviously here we have bionic eyes, we're like Superman now, we know what happened. But when you look at the author list, nobody knows who's doing what, right? But we know. Now we have that privilege to be able to comment on it. But when you look at it, when it's published, you're not really sure who did what, unless the journal itself requires you to say a little thing about the level of contribution. But again, the journal, as we're going to see, will not try to arbitrate any of those issues, right? There's a level of trust that is there. But again, whether you're a first year or grad student or whatever, we don't care. Seniority, as you said, here shouldn't matter, right? It is about the level of contribution that you make. But what type of contribution? And what would be considered as more contribution than anything else? Now, here, I didn't actually mention what type of research that was, okay? Imagine working in not just in medical research, but you're working with a large group that includes physicians, includes people from other disciplines, including social science. And everybody's doing their part. But maybe the section from the clinician is half a page. And the section from the social scientist is 2 pages long. Does that necessarily mean that one has contributed more than the other? Because we said seniority is not important. And now we look at contribution itself. Does that mean that that individual, because they wrote a page and a half more than the other, means that they've actually contributed more to the article?
I guess it depends on the key selling point of that particular paper. If the key selling point is about work that has been done by the physician who wrote the 1 page versus another person who wrote the 2 pages, perhaps then the first, more credit should be given to the person who did most of the work that is the key selling point of that paper.
Yes.
In the social sciences, I think it would depend on what section of the paper you were writing. If your extra page was in the methods section, it's not going to be as important as, say, the discussion section, where you're actually analyzing the implications of the findings, which is where the real significant intellectual work would often be.
True.
So it depends.
It depends. I think the answer is it depends. You might have situations where you're publishing with librarians, and it's about a systematic review of the literature. Well, guess what? Methodology is the most important thing, right? How it was done and what were the results and so on. So it will depend, and we're going to come back to that, and you know, during this presentation. Obviously, the other funny stuff, like, you know, was there and they didn't do anything. I think we all agree that these are things that should not be happening. I'm interested by the head honcho. I'm interested by the last author. Well, here, last author probably refers to the health research world, because, you know, seniority is first or last, depending on where you're submitting. In social sciences, especially the field that I'm from, law, it's usually first, second, will tell you how much contribution was actually made. But what about the head honcho? Got the funding. That took a lot of work. Probably overseeing the whole experiments. Right? Did not see the paper here or read it. But you know what? If it wasn't for him or her, this would not have been possible.
Yeah, but you could say that about Statistics Canada. How many scholars rely on Statistics Canada's research, but Statistics Canada isn't a co-author? So even then, I think that still depends. You know, because if the person hasn't read the paper, then they can't defend the paper. And my understanding is that is key point for authorship, that when I'm a part of a research group or one person was actually, they volunteered to drop them, like to drop out of a particular paper, but they were also, it was agreed that they should do that because they weren't involved in that particular paper's production. They're co-authored on other papers that they have been very involved in, but because of their personal circumstances, they weren't able to be involved in that paper, so they were dropped. Now, they're not the senior author by any stretch of the imagination, but to me, if you haven't read it, how can you defend it? And that would be key.
Yes. There could be enough trust in the team that the head honcho or the head, you know, the senior author doesn't really need to, you know, I trust my group. They know what they're doing. I've been there, you know, overseen their experiments, checked out the results, talked, discussed with them, said, you know, listen, I mean, that's the problem. I looked at the outline too, but I didn't actually read the paper.
I wouldn't put my name in a paper that I haven't read. It's too much responsibility. I mean, it's not only the honor that comes with the recognition of having your name in, which certainly we like, and it's in the annual review every year, so it counts. But if your name is not there, you can be putting yourself in a very difficult situation if the paper is recalled or if there's any problem with it. So, you know.
Why risk your reputation?
Absolutely.
And your lab's reputation and your group's reputation?
Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, we're really picking up on main elements here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how that actually is or isn't actually dealt with. So let's look at nature. Many of you know about nature as a publication, and here's what they talk when they say, or this is the policy around author contributions. The authors are required to include a statement to specify the contributions of each co-author. The statement can be up to several sentences long, describing the tasks of individual authors referred to by their initials. Okay, so here you have a journal that, you know, is not just going to be seeing the author list and saying, okay, it's fine. No, they actually want you to explain how did that actually happen. And this is what they say when it comes to the author list. The author list should include all appropriate researchers and no others. Authorship provides credit for a researcher's contributions to a study and carries accountability. The nature journals do not prescribe the kinds of contributions that warrant authorship, but encourage transparency by publishing author contribution statements. Nature journal editors are not in a position to investigate or adjudicate authorship disputes before or after publication. Such disagreements, if they cannot be resolved amongst authors, should be brought up to the relevant institutional authority. So basically they've done their share, or at least that's what how they see it. They've done their share by not only asking you to list the authors, but also asking you about their contributions. But they're not going to go deeper into the, into the matter and say, okay, no, you're not here, you're going to be first or second. They're going to leave it to the authors to deal with that. This is science. Authors in science must fulfill the criteria described below that are informed by the ICMGE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, defining authorship. Specifically, contributions should be one or more of the following: formulation of theory and prediction, contributions to experimental conception and design, acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, drafting the article, or revising it critically for important intellectual content. All individuals who meet these criteria must be listed as authors. In addition, all authors must agree to be so listed and are expected to critically read and approve the submitted version to be published. So if we go back to the example that we just talked about, whether you're senior or not, or the person who was behind the funding, that would not meet the guidelines on authorship or the principles on authorship if you haven't actually contributed significantly to the text or even approved it. It's not something that's implicit. Yeah, I trust you guys, go ahead and do it. Because in some ways, as we were talking about in the beginning about credibility and trust of the public in terms of research and how it actually impacts, if we're putting out there information that's wrong or falsified or misleading, then we're going to break that trust. And you're not only going to break it with the public, you're going to break it also with the policymakers, you're going to break it with your colleagues, you're going to break it with your research community as well. So it's really important that you be accountable for it. So what are the ICMG criteria? Because if you go through the different journals, you'll see this coming many times. So the ICMG recommends that authorship be based on the following 4 criteria. First, substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. And, it's not or, and drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content. And final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work, and ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. And all the criteria that you see here, these are cumulative, right? Cumulative, meaning that you can't just have one, you have to have all 4 to merit authorship. Now, if that's the case, then if we go back to that author list that we've seen together, keep in mind what we just said. So if we go back to the author list that we saw together, can we just work together on seeing here what would certainly be out of the authorship list? So the first one, would that person be in or out? The senior grad student on the project made the figures.
In, maybe in a different position.
In, potentially, in a different position.
Yeah.
Second author is a grad student in the lab that has nothing to do with this project. Out.
Maybe not.
Right? I mean, nothing to do with the project, so would not fit any of the, criteria. They haven't done any of the research, the intellectual contribution is not there. The food contribution maybe, but the intellectual one is not there. And then you have the third author who actually did the experiments, wrote the paper. We all agreed that that person is in. The middle author's name are reserved for undergrads and technical staff. Depends what was their contribution. It doesn't tell us here. Okay, but if we just read it that way, they're out. But we're going to have to ask the proper questions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The second to last author is the person who instigated the paper.
What does instigate mean?
Well, meaning that, let's say you were meeting with a group and you said, you know what, this actually could be a very interesting topic to look at. I've actually read a paper and it said this, but there was a little problem with that. If you can maybe, only if we can write something on this.
If it's only that, then it's not a very substantive contribution.
Mhm.
But if the person was involved in kind of framing the discussion and really, critically delving into, or interpreting the data, then maybe that's fine.
Yeah, but maybe he instigated or she instigated it,
Yeah.
but because they've collected the data as well. Maybe.
Yeah.
No,
Sure.
but there are so many things that are
We
not
don't
clear
know.
from this
Mhm.
segment, but if it's only instigation, then we agree
Then
that
it's
it's
not.
not respecting it.
Mhm.
And then you have the last author, who is senior, got the funding. And again, funding is not a small thing.
Mhm.
It's not a small thing, right? And then, but did not read the paper,
Should read the paper that wants the name in.
right? I mean,
That's
if we
it.
follow those recommendations,
Mhm.
that person would not be. Yes,
I have to respectfully disagree with you on the
sure.
penultimate author, because, instigated the paper is a broad term, can mean
Mhm.
anything, but he's the one with the vision and who formulated the theory and the concept. None of this would have happened. So it's easy to just gather data and then put everything together, but if you don't see how it comes together, if you don't have an idea how to start with,
Yeah.
then he is, I would argue, that one of the main authors in this paper.
You're talking about the one who's instigating it, or
Yes,
the?
the one who's instigating.
Yeah, but if he hasn't read the paper.
Well, I don't see here that he hasn't. Just
No,
judging
sure,
by
no,
this.
and I think we said that. We said depending on their level of involvement, right?
Yeah.
Right.
If they instigated the paper, so they came up, and that's not an easy thing either,
Mhm.
because, when you're sitting down, it means because you've done work in this field, and if it actually builds up to be an article, it means you've really put a lot of thought in it. I think what we were saying is, if it's only instigation of the paper saying, yeah, I think that's a good idea, then there's an issue, as we mentioned, of accountability,
Right.
right? They shouldn't be there because they just instigated it. But there are some information that we don't have here. Have they, for example, read this? Did they write anything? Did they critically revise it? Did they approve it? If they did, then they would be, satisfactorily.
Right.
But if they don't, then that would be an issue.
It's a hypothetical situation, but
Sure,
in
sure.
that case, probably the best thing would be to make that person read the article,
Yeah.
because if you leave him out,
Yeah.
he has valid cause to argue that he should be on the paper.
But
No.
I want to flip that around. And it comes to the same point. I was coming to that, but you've brought it up, which is someone has instigated something. Can you write it without, if you're working together in a group, someone came up and said, you know what, that would be absolutely an interesting article. I've read, this, I've written on that, and I've actually collected data, the results tell me this, this, and that. Only if we can write something on this. And 3 of the people who were sitting there decided to write the paper. And, well, he just instigated it. He didn't read it. He didn't do anything. So why can't I put him as an author? I don't want to, he doesn't deserve to be an author.
Right.
But there's another issue with that, which is what?
Was he offered to read it?
Exactly. But more than that, because we were talking about research integrity at the beginning.
You mean like intellectual property or?
Honesty. Right? Honesty. And transparency. Right? Then if we don't do that, what will end up happening? Nobody's going to talk about the research. Nobody's going to say anything about the research. There are some situations where, because we are in a culture that really promotes knowledge sharing, that there are even some times where in discussions or meetings or conferences, you have people, just respectfully telling everyone, this information has not been published. And this is the reason why we're not going to be sharing, but I would like to at least discuss with you some of our results. This is the kind of culture that we are trying to build, because otherwise nobody's going to do that presentation. Nobody's going to talk about the research, and that's going to be detrimental at the end of the day. So honesty here comes back as a very important point. Yes?
I would also like the concern about the last author, because usually he's going to be the corresponding author, right, for the paper. And
Depends, yeah.
by the next 10 years, like all the grassroots will be gone, and he will be the only one left for any further correspondence. So like, I feel like there's a need for someone, like a permanent person on the paper, just in order to have good feedback.
Sure.
So like in that case, like in that regard, like the last author would deserve to be.
Sure.
Because he's the only permanent member.
And I think what we're trying to do here is say, what would have been better, right? So what would have been the best approach to that? Now, again, the senior grad, we said, you know, they've worked, they did the figures, but we don't even know what the figures mean. You can just take something and then just put it in a diagram. It could actually be a web designer, or it could be a graphist. That doesn't mean anything. But we're going to have to investigate a little bit more. Do they, you know, respect all the different criteria? The second author, we agreed that that person should not be there. Same thing with the middle authors who have nothing to do with this project, unless they actually did have something to do with the project. Third author, we said, because they wrote the whole paper, deserve to be on the author list. The second to last is the one who instigated it. If we were to go back in time, right, the first thing that we would have done is said, listen, we talked about this, you know, a few weeks ago. We were actually very interested in writing something if you know, think it's a good idea. And we would be very happy to have you as one of the authors, and then work together on that paper. He instigated it, but he will have to, or she will be involved in the whole production of it. The last author here, that's a bit of a tricky issue, because we talked about corresponding, you know, authorship, meaning in 10 years from now someone wants questions, they can contact that individual. And you're not going to be changing every time someone goes to a different institution if they're, you know, junior. But again, there are questions here. Getting funding is actually extremely difficult. And having a team of people and getting people, and it probably is the person who has, you know, asked people to come and join in because it's his project or her project and they're interested in having a lot of people participate in it. But again, the question is, funding alone is not the reason why someone would be an author. And if you haven't read the paper, you can't be author. And here we're not talking about practice. We're talking about through the principles. Okay? Because practice is always difficult. Because here you're talking also about power relations. Okay? These are the things that people don't want to talk about, but we'll talk about it. There's power relations here. You have the last author is an individual who perhaps leads the team, brought the funding is under his or her name, but at the same time doesn't want to read it, doesn't want to comment on it, right? And that's it. That is not proper, you know, that's not proper attribution. It doesn't matter if you're the one who's bringing the funding. It doesn't matter if there's a lot of paper that are written within your group, as long as you have a very important role to make, that you critically revise, that you actually approve, read, and sign off on it, then there is absolutely no problem to be an author here. Absolutely no problem, you know. But it's the same idea again with the person instigating this. I think you should offer, right? Because if it wasn't for that person who has received the funding, and obviously they didn't receive the funding because of their name, they received the funding because of the application that they submitted, which had a very good idea that was deserving, you know, to be funded. I think it would be very important to actually offer that person to be a co-author, and they will have to fulfill all the requirements for authorship. I think one thing that we would agree on is that there is no such thing as automatic authorship. At least there shouldn't. Okay? But offering authorship to individuals, I think, is something that comes back to the issue of honesty and transparency. Okay?
What about
about those people who are in the administration who give you access to data and, for example, they ask you to come and do some research about their data and problems they have in their institution? I have seen always they have in the authorship.
So people who...
The high administration people, like head of the certain departments or...
Okay. I mean, again, it's a question of power relations, but I think it's really important for the individual, you know, to be able to sign off on all the, or satisfy all the criteria here. If that individual only requests that their name be put as author automatically, then they are putting themselves in a very big accountability situation, because they probably haven't read the article, haven't seen it, haven't reviewed it for, you know, critical purposes, and that would end up being a problem for them.
Maybe they are in the committee meetings, they come for committee meetings, but not that much.
Sure, but again, for me, as someone who's working with a team of individuals, I would not want my name to be put automatically on papers. Not just because we've worked together and I'm, let's say, managing a certain project, or, you know, if I was a very, very senior individual, I was able to get the funding for the project, I wouldn't want my name to be there if I haven't had the chance to, first of all, discuss the project with the individual, review it, contribute to it, and approve it. Because I don't want my name to be there when I'm not approving something. What happens if, for whatever reason, the information that is there has been falsified?
The problem is, I noticed that there is pressure.
Mhm.
Like, other people are doing this. Other people are having this.
Sure.
I compare myself to other people not having the same thing. So I want to do the same thing.
Yep.
That's what I noticed from
Sure.
their views.
Sure, we're going to come back to that, because, again, it's an issue that I don't think has a straight or clear kind of algorithm. This is how it's going to be, and that's an author, that's not an author. There are some issues with the ICMG criteria that we're going to talk about in a moment, but if you do not, right, meet all 4 criteria for authorship, you should not be listed as authors, okay? You should be, therefore, acknowledged. Okay. Someone has, you know, revised the article, just, you know, provided some revisions or suggested changes, like as a peer reviewer, you know, a friend that you know has had the chance to look at it. They don't merit authorship unless they satisfy all the criteria. But they did revise it critically. You should offer to acknowledge them and say, you know, I would like to acknowledge the comments made by an individual as well. And then you have some journals who actually go into details on how the acknowledgement should be done. Acknowledgement should be brief and should not include thanks to anonymous referees and editors, in essential words or effusive comments. A person can be thanked for assistance, not excellent assistance, or for comments, not insightful comments, right? Because who can decide what was insightful and what was excellent? Just say for their comments or for their assistance. Acknowledgements can contain grant and contribution numbers. That's another important point, right? So you receive funding for a specific project. There's no way you can publish without actually thanking those that have allowed you to publish. Doesn't mean you put them as authors, right? But you put them in the acknowledgement section because it's a way for you to be able to, you know, present to the public that, you know, this was done thanks to the following funding. And it's also good because if this is read by members of the public, they'll be able to see that their money, their taxpayer money, is actually used for research, and it kind of creates an element of trust. But there's another reason why this would be very pertinent. Your source of funding.
Mm-hmm. Possible biases or conflicts of interest.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
It's always good to be able to present this, and this would fall under honesty, under transparency. okay? You would be able to say, I got funding from the following, funds or the following organizations allow me to do my work. There are, in certain instances, some organizations that actually do not allow researchers funded by them to be also funded by other types of organizations because of the huge conflict of interest that would create. Okay? So it's very important. It's also an element of honesty.
So
Can I
how do you verify this? For example, if I'm not very expert in the funding.
Sure.
If someone has some money from certain organization, then he did another project with this funding, like he has some extra money or something, and
Sure.
then he did another project. Has to inform the.
So basically the way it works is once you get, you have to submit an application for funding, and usually it has to do with a certain project, a certain, in a certain field with specific deliverables. And you publish, when you publish, most of the times in the agreements that you sign with the funder, there is always an acknowledgement sentence or phrase that they ask you to put in every publication and in every conferences. And that provides enough information for anybody to be able to know which one it is. And there are usually situations where there are numbers that are also associated with the funds that you've received. And this, in some databases, would allow people to be able to see who was on it and what was the topic. And almost all funders require reports that are done annually, sometimes done quarterly, sometimes done every 6 months, where you will be saying what kind of work you've done with the money. And if what you're studying is, the overall density in engineering, project, and then you publish something on how red are the tomatoes, they're going to be able to see this very quickly. They're going to say, what's that? And why are our funds used for this? Okay? So it really has to be obviously very pertinent to what you're doing. Yes?
I have 2 points about acknowledgements.
Yes.
I'm surprised that Nature doesn't ask authors to check with people before putting their names in, since they're so strict with the authorship,
Mhm.
that they would allow you to put anybody's name
You mean anybody's name as in...
as an acknowledgement.
Well, to be honest, this is just one part of it.
Okay,
You would
so
probably
maybe
have to
there's-
go back to the authorship policy and just make sure that there isn't anything
Okay.
on that element. But again, you can ask and recommend a lot of things, but in real practice, the issue is for publishers is how much you can actually investigate and look to. When someone is telling you this is how we've contributed to this project, how far can you go as a publisher to say, well, show me evidence? So there are some elements, but I personally would offer someone
To be acknowledged
to be
or not?
acknowledged
Yeah.
with something and not just automatically put them either.
Yeah.
Because some individuals might not want to be associated with certain research. They did it for purposes that are personal. I'm happy to help you with this, but I don't want to be author on it. And they don't say anything about acknowledgement. It's like, okay, well, he did so much or she did so much. I have to at least acknowledge them, offer them the acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And I've seen situations where people have said, I don't want to be acknowledged.
Yeah, that's happened to me too.
Okay? And that's totally fine.
Mhm.
But if you have their name, you know what the problem is. It's when you Google search,
Yeah.
and their name is going to appear, and there's just, associated with something that they haven't written. It's not always pleasant. Okay, so we have to be careful on that as well. Was there any other question?
Another comment is that
Yes.
has happened to me is I understand Nature's point
Mhm.
for the acknowledgements, but sometimes the acknowledgements is kind of the way to get rid of or to negotiate the authorship in a way. So if at least the person can be passed on to acknowledgements, you feel like you're giving something. And so taking out the adjectives, I understand that it's kind of cleaner, but sometimes it just makes you feel better because you say, for the helpful assistance or whatever. Like, I know helpful assistance is a redundancy, but it's a way of recognizing the
Sure.
effort the person made. So
Sure. But I
It's a bit
do
strict,
think,
but-
you know, I to be honest, I'm not in their minds of why this is done, but I could also understand a little bit their approach is you're presenting this to people, and people have no ability to know whether it was insightful or
Yeah.
it was just,
Yeah, no,
you know, small. So
Yeah.
just say assistance, and it could be anything,
Yeah.
right? But again, you know, it's an interesting, you know, approach, and I think they felt so strongly about it that they wanted to write and ask people not to do it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
I wonder though how much a lot of flattery and sucking up might have gone on in using this kind of terminology.
Yes.
So I would actually agree in dropping
Yeah, the
excellent and insightful, because the fact that you're even acknowledging them meant that they did something enough
Mhm.
to have made it worthwhile for you to say
Yeah.
thank you.
And usually in academia, there's a lot of dryness in terms of how we present, you know, the information. And I guess that's where it's coming from, is that, you know, we can just simply say that they've been, you know, they've provided assistance. It could be small, it could be big, nobody needs to know. But if you say it is, we have no way as a reader to know if it was the case or not. And sometimes it looks a little odd. There's so much of this. Incredible music, unbelievable, insightful. Okay, but there are some issues with the ICGME criteria, and these were things that have received some form of criticism in some of the recent papers on the topic. And one of them we're going to talk a little bit about in a moment. So, proper labeling of industry publications, requiring readers to be notified at the outset of an industry, articles' true provenance, ownership, and commercial functions. So at the ICMGE, there isn't really a lot discussed about this particular aspect, or at least recommendations put on this particular aspect. If this work is done as an industry publication, for some authors, including this one, it would be very pertinent that it actually be presented from the outset. You know, when you even start writing the article itself, to actually bring that to people's attention. Not wait until the little conflict of interest or the acknowledgement to say a few words, which are really usually written in very small, you know, letters, but actually present this from the beginning so that you allow the reader to be very aware of the context in which they should read this article. Okay? And the other point is there is no advice on author order. So we talked about contributions, significance, and signing off on things, but there isn't really that much guidance on what order should we follow. And if you've seen from the publications that we looked at, some of the examples from their authorship policies, they don't actually want to get involved in this. Right? It's up to you guys to decide this. But, you know, it's not that easy. Right? So we did talk about that senior grad who was first author just because they did the figures. And we talked about the junior student who is third in line because they've just, you know, they've done everything, but they think it's fair. And then you have, you know, other people that are there because of their seniority. If we would just focus on the contribution, what would be the best way to approach this? And think in kind of an ideal situation.
I think I've noticed through here that why authorship is a very big issue. Why it is not very clear for everybody what are the guidelines, what are the issues, and why, for example, for a lecture like this or a workshop like this, not many people are coming. Why not the related? I mean, some people have issues and they don't come to this type of workshop. I don't see that.
Yeah.
The integrity workshop. I want to see more, like, but I don't see those people, for example, who have issues. Only people who are very keen to follow these guidelines come to this type of workshops.
And-
How can you make sure these people who are publishing all the time
Yeah.
know about all these?
This is why we're filming.
Okay.
And this is why we're filming. Hopefully more people will be able to benefit from the humble contribution we're making here today. But how would you deal? I think it's not an easy question. How do you deal with authorship? The order of authors. I have personally a very straight answer to it, but I want to hear your thoughts on it, because it's not an easy issue.
Integrity and honesty.
Sorry?
Integrity and honesty.
Integrity and honesty, sure, but how would that work in practice?
Yeah, they're not measurable. How can you measure things like that?
But generally, the order of the authorship really depends on the principal investigator and the person, either the head honcho or the assistant professor who's
Yep.
who's guiding the entire project. And if the rest of the authors are agreeable to that particular order, and if the principal investigator is okay with that, then generally that becomes what's the exact order. But with reference to that specific example that we gave, I kind of feel like the first author should have been that junior student who actually did most of the experiments and wrote the paper, because I think you should give credit where credit is due. And usually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like usually when people read papers and they look at the authors, they will only look at the first author and the last author. Where the last author is the principal investigator and the first author is the one who, generally people, I would assume that he or she is the one who contributed the most to the project.
Yep. Okay. Okay, yes?
I think that depends a lot on the discipline, because in political science, the last author is not the PI. We don't have that convention as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
What we've done in our project is the authorship order varies from one paper to the next based on who takes the lead. One of the benefits of having multiple members is that we can each work on a paper or take the lead on a paper. So the person who's responsible for doing most of the work on that particular paper, he's the one who gets listed first, and then we do it in descending order of contribution. And so it varies from one paper to the next.
Okay.
And we only drop someone if they're not, basically if they haven't done all those 4 criteria, which we just kind of did instinctively. We didn't have a criteria. But yeah, but for us it's in order of contributions on that one particular paper. So it means that the PI isn't always the first person.
I think discussion.
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So I have no experience in the political sciences or the humanities field, but in STEM, I think the fairest thing would be to get rid of the first author, last author. But ideally, if we were following the authorship and everyone who participated, contributed, got on the author list, we could have a, authorship circle instead of a list. So you don't know who's the first author, who's the second author.
I love that. It's like a little
Yeah.
circle.
So
Choose.
Humans are unfortunately not that perfect, so we can't really have a. But ideally, it would be that there is no first author. All of these people contributed. This is their work, and
Okay.
they are on this paper.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, you were going to say something.
I think discussion can be made before writing anything, so you can just work out the content.
Okay. Okay, so again, this is one of the criticisms that were made on the ICMG, is that there's not enough guidance, and there are some people who actually wrote on it. And this is what it is about. The procedure calls for continuous group dialogue where team members discuss their roles and contributions to determine and justify authorship order. And I personally tend to agree with that. Okay? So now you have that situation. If we're talking about an authorship or a paper that is built from, from a research project that has been funded, obviously the individual that has to be aware, she has to be aware of this is PI, right? Because it's under their responsibility. And usually the PI instigates and says, okay, now we have to publish on this matter. I think what needs to be done is whoever is going to be involved in the publication, you just need to sit down together and discuss. The PI needs to be obviously aware and approve of the mechanism of how this is going to be done, because that person is providing the leadership. A junior student might not be able to know and might actually not receive fair share if there isn't leadership around. So the PI has the responsibility to ensure that they are first aware of the fact that there's a paper that's going to be written, Nobody in their team should be publishing something using, funds that come from the project without them being aware of. I think that's not honest, and that is a very big, transparency issue and an honesty issue. But let's say they are aware and they are the ones who are dealing with this. There needs to be a frank discussion with the team members who are going to be involved. Okay, I as the PI really don't have enough time to lead this publication. I'm happy to provide you with the data that I have collected. I'm happy to revise it, even write this small section from my most recent, results, and I will review it before it is done. So I don't, I'm not going to be leading this. And then you have, other people who sometimes would come from the same expertise but they're ready to work together, or sometimes have different expertise that are complementary to the writing of this. Whoever's going to be the first author needs to be the one who's going to take a coordinator kind of role. Other than the fact that they're contributing perhaps the most, they're going to be also taking some form of responsibility in terms of making sure that things are done properly. Okay? So if you are the first author, there is a responsibility that you have. You can't just simply say, well, I'm going to write the introduction, first section, that's it. No. If there are other people that are involved, even the PI, you will make sure to ensure that whatever was decided at the beginning will be done, and that will be also part of your role. Not only contributing the most, but also coordinating and making sure that it's actually submitted on time. Everybody has a chance to revise it. You've received all the comments. They were all included, and everybody approved it, and it is submitted. There is that kind of responsibility. And I think you can't do this as you go by. That needs to be a clear and frank discussion from the get-go. If you're asked to participate in a research project and write a paper, ask those questions. Do it from the beginning. Manage expectations from the get-go.
I have a specific question in relation to what you said.
Yeah.
What if in this scenario where this specific publication has been sent for review,
Yes.
and we've gotten the reviewers' comments about, okay, some parts is lacking, some information is lacking, and so this is during the review process, and so the group decides to work on that particular area that the reviewer has mentioned.
Sure.
However, this few experiments, let's say, was done with somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Does it merit that person to be part of the author?
It is possible. It is possible. But any change in authorship after submission is going to be scrutinized by the editors. So they will tell you, I've seen this person added. Can you please explain why that change happened? And you will say, well, listen, we've received a comment that was a significant, substantial comment, substantial change that needs to be a major modification, and that required us to bring in a new expertise. And this is why that individual was added to the author list. It might be a situation where someone is left out, although I see it as extremely rare after a major comment. But even if that's the case, they're going to also ask why that person has been removed. Because so they're not going to proactively look for and investigate. But if something comes up to them, they're going to ask you questions.
But based on the ICMJE criteria, that person should be part of the authorship and not relegated to acknowledgements.
Which one?
The additional expertise who ran the additional experiment.
Well, obviously, if they are coming in with significant intellectual contribution, right, they're going to be revising the article, and they're going to be also approving it and being accountable for it. They match. They satisfy the criteria, and therefore they should be. Okay, where? That's another question. But that's where you have to have a proper dialogue with the team. And do it from the beginning. Don't wait until the end. Don't wait until half of the work is done and you're like, okay, should I be first author or second author? Be very clear. And that's how you're going to manage expectations. As a PI, that's your role. That's your leadership. Right? You should be, saying, okay, listen, I think if you agree, you'll be the one leading it, you'll be the first author on this, and this is what we're looking for. If you are a researcher, or even a student, you have a colleague that's contacting you and saying, I would actually like to write something with you, ask the same questions. Are you going to take the lead on it, or should I take the lead on it? And that is a synonym for who should be first author. And if you feel that it's not clear, make sure it's clear. Because the last thing you want is putting a lot of effort on something and then be relegated to second author. You just want to make sure that it's clear. Because if they tell you, I'm actually leading this, and I would like to, you to be a co-author on it, if they start asking you to do most of the work, this is where you say, wait a minute, I'm sorry, I think our understanding was from the beginning that she would be leading this. And I don't feel actually very comfortable taking on so much responsibilities and be put as second author. If you're okay and you're fine, if you want me to do this, I would actually feel more comfortable if you put me as first author. And they can tell you, no, I can't do that. So you say, okay, well then, this is as much as I can put. Okay? Again, it's a question of fairness to the individuals. Because otherwise, it's just going to be very easy. Okay? And ensure, if you're putting yourself as a senior author in any place, make sure that you actually do the work. Right? Because it is also something that we will be teaching our students and teaching, or not teaching, but rather giving a good example for our peers. When you are very fair with your students, and I've had the chance to work with people where that was the case, and encouraged me to actually publish, but they were fair to me and allowed me to actually contribute in a way that I was attributed, not in third authorship, but actually even first author. That allowed me to continue that later on with my other, either research assistants or students or colleagues. And that question of managing expectation, sometimes we don't feel very comfortable with. Some people might feel, well, maybe I'm not I don't have enough seniority, I'm worried if I say that, it's going to be looked at negatively, oh, he's or she's the one who's always asking, wants to be first. No, it's just a question of transparency. I'm more than happy to help. I'm more than happy to contribute. I just want to know what is expected of me. And that's the dialogue. That's what we should have. That's what we should promote. As I said, and these authors say the same thing, there isn't no such thing as an algorithm that where you can put numbers and then it'll tell you that's first, second, third, or fourth author. It's a question of managing expectations and having a proper dialogue. And you can always come back to that dialogue in case there are some disagreements at the end. And it's also a question of promoting trust. This is how you sustain it as well. And it's about research integrity. Another point that I wanted to raise, and we'll end with this, has to do with different types of projects. So we was talking about, I was talking about biobanks just earlier. So you have a situation where you are doing a large research project where you're collecting data and samples. And when you're collecting data and samples, you're collecting this for many years and they're going to be there for other researchers to access them. The difficulty with this is you also want to promote the actual bioresource itself. And how do you actually acknowledge it? How do you actually present it? So there are some authors that have written a form of guidance document where they look at those special examples of research projects that the ICMG doesn't go into details on and try to come up with potential solutions. So this is one of them. It's called the Cobra Guidelines. And these guidelines talk about how to actually properly cite bioresources in journal articles. And it spans, there's different types. So you can have in the acknowledgement section, there could be something about the biobank itself. There could also be, in that same article, a reference to the marker paper. So the paper that the bioresource members have written, right, on what the bioresource is about and its importance and what it provides. Referencing of that article ensures that it is cited in every article that has been, that uses the data and samples from that bioresource. And there's a lot of other, possibilities there. There's actually, a discussion of not even putting in the acknowledgement, putting in the abstract as well, because this is what people search for, and it brings a lot more visibility. So, it just tells you that, yes, we can talk about the ICMGE, international guidelines, but nothing is perfect. And it requires a mix of following the general principles, because it always comes back to it. We were saying this at the beginning, fairness, honesty, openness, all of that. And every time we were talking about an example, we found out that there's something there that didn't fit because of lack of accountability, because of lack of fairness, because of lack of openness. And again, manage expectations and ensure that there's a proper dialogue, right? And don't hesitate to actually ask. Sometimes you'll have guidelines within the same publications. Sometimes you have in certain groups, some code of conducts and things that you can look at. But again, what you have in paper is not necessarily what's happening in practice. So it's about changing that practice. And this is the goal of today's presentation, was to just familiarize you a little bit with some of the issues. But for most of you here, a lot of the stuff that you saw today were probably presented in a more organized manner, but are things that you've had internally or thought of internally. And that's fine. But now you can link them to principles that we saw at the beginning. Right? And these are what actually allows us to do the work, ethically and with a lot of integrity. Again, the word is trust. That's what you're building. Coming back to the idea of news, well, losing trust in your colleagues, losing trust in the research community, or losing the trust of the public is detrimental to science. Whether it's social science, whether it's health sciences, whether it's in engineering, whatever. Trust is the main component. Thank you very much. Okay. Do you have any questions that we haven't looked at, or maybe areas that you would be interested in discussing? Yes.
You said very also about agreements and all these things from the early stage.
Yeah.
Does this have to be done orally or by written? Because sometimes they change their mind in the middle of.
Sure.
So how can you make sure?
I think you would always go with the element that keeps trust. Sometimes doing things in a written fashion perhaps could present a lack of trust. Like, I don't trust you enough, I want you to write it down and sign that you're actually going to give me first up. Sometimes it's not the best approach. What you need, well, I guess it depends on the individuals and your experience with them. Sometimes you have no choice, but you have to put that in an email, and you have to have them confirm that's the plan. But, this is because you've had experiences showing you that, unfortunately it's not, if I don't do that, then they're always going to tell me, no, we decided otherwise, remember. But that again is not necessarily the first thing that you would go for, because it does give the impression that there is a lack of trust. But sometimes it is the best approach. Yes?
A common question.
Sure.
I have a comment, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it.
Wow.
In one of the latest XKCD comics, I'm not sure if you follow it, but that was
The what?
the XKCD comics.
Okay.
It's about comics similar to the PhD comics. The author took through various fields, I think 20 of the scientific fields like chemistry, medicine, psychology, so on. He took the top 10 journals in it, the last 10 papers in those top 10 journals, and counted the number of authors, and then got an average number for each field. So it goes from, I think in psychology the average is 1.5 to 2, to physics where the average is, the high energy physics where average is 200.
200.
Yes.
Wow.
So when you have something like that, 200, the concept of first author, last author kind of breaks down. It's a bit insane.
Well, or sometimes it could be very very much more emphasized because you've led 200 authors, right?
Right. So what's your opinion on that?
You see, I unfortunately I'm not in that field, but I actually did see, like sometimes I would either be asked to comment or write, letters of reference, and I see sometimes people's CVs that because we're in an interdisciplinary world, I'm able to actually comment on our work together. And I look at their CVs and they're 1 in 55 authors. And for me, coming from law, where I almost kill myself to be able to write one paper which was 55 pages, but as a sole author, looking at it with 50 authors, for me, it was like, whoa, wait a minute. So how do we know what is the contribution? Sometimes they're just put in alphabetical order, because they've all worked on the same, let's say, project. I think for me, it was all about discipline. It always comes back to discipline. I know for a fact that a lot of the professions and a lot of the research groups have created their own sort of policies around this. And there are even associations for, let's say, chemists or so on that have actually even enacted policies. I've seen this in one of the articles that I mentioned that we're looking at. I think either it was the American Psychology Association or something like that. They've had their own policies on how this should be done. And I think you should always go back to the way, if there is a policy on that matter, what would that policy say? Because here you have the community itself from almost an objective perspective looking at this and saying this is what would fit, fairness and so on. And I think most of the times these policies are also shaped by the publications where they will be submitted to. And the publishers themselves could have also some criteria that would allow this to actually, where 200 authors would actually fit because they fit all the criteria that are mentioned there. The ICMGE ones are just one example. And these are for medical journals, so there are other domains out there. And they just provide us with interesting criteria that I think people could relate to from various principles, but it's not exactly what necessarily is happening in all over the place. So I would say, for me, it looks odd, but that's, and I know it's normal because I've seen it, and sometimes you receive kind of emails from colleagues, just as jokes saying, they were like number 137, and the author, they were happy about it because it was going to be published in a very big, high-impact journal. But that's the discipline. As long as there is a fair set of criteria that are followed, I think, we should be mindful of how the disciplines work. But if it's arbitrary, then there's a problem. And sometimes, and I think some people here mentioned it, there are times where for lower numbers, let's go back to 1.5, okay? So for the lower numbers where you have 3 or 4 authors, sometimes the first 2 authors have contributed equally. And there are ways actually to mention that in the text, and even in the way it is cited. Because let's say my last name is Zawati, I'm publishing with 3 or 4 other authors, let's say 5 authors, it would be Zawati et al. But because the second author also contributed equally, it would be Zawati and the other author et al. So there are even ways to do that. I guess, again, coming back to the core elements, honesty, openness, accountability, fairness. That's what should, in theory and hopefully in practice, be used.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you have any experience with, it seems like this is a very North American view or Western view. Do you have experience working with people in completely different cultural settings, and how you negotiate that when you have collaborative work?
That's actually a very good question. Yes, I mean, I have, but it always comes back to the same principle, which is a dialogue and clarification on how things should be done. Unfortunately, because of the the malpractice that has happened, in various situations, some countries actually don't even allow their samples to leave the country because they're worried that they're going to be used, and it's going to benefit the researchers who are actually using it outside of the country. So therefore, they make it mandatory to actually collaborate with someone within the country itself to be able to actually use the samples. And this is a reaction to this situation where some people have actually been unfairly treated. my philosophy, again, is the same thing. I'm happy to work, and a lot of my work sometimes includes people that are outside Canada, in Europe, in the Middle East, you know, and Asia. I always sit down with them or talk to them, manage expectations. Who is going to lead this? Okay, you're going to lead us. Where exactly do you see my part fitting in? And then I would ask for, you know, a tip, an outline of what is exactly going to be talked about. And then I will know where my, you know, contribution will be. And in that case, then we're all on the same page. These kind of situations, you'll have to probably go and look at it from people who are both from the same place. And they will probably tell you, you know, their thoughts, and we can maybe compare. But from someone who has lived under, you know, this academic culture, I always use what I've learned here and deal with others the same way. But, you know, it will be interesting to talk to people that are actually living in other countries and saying, okay, what's your approach? And don't be surprised to hear that things are not necessarily done.
They're not transparent.
Yeah.
I can tell you they're not transparent.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.